and to have family and friends is the best thing in the world. Other than knowing the Lord Jesus, family is the best thing in the world. Amen?
Amen. Elvis Presley died on a Tuesday, or at least that's what they told us. August 16th, 1977, Memphis, Tennessee. The official story goes that the king of rock and roll was found unresponsive on the bathroom floor of Graceland by his fiancée, Ginger Alden. He was 42 years old. The world stopped. Radio stations interrupted their programming. Grown men pulled their cars to the side of the road and wept. A woman in New Jersey collapsed on her front porch when she heard the news. Elvis wasn't just a celebrity. He was a god, walking around in a white jumpsuit. And gods aren't supposed to die on bathroom floors. But here's what quietly never sat right with people. Not the conspiracy theorists, not the fringe. Ordinary people, family friends, journalists, even some of the medical professionals adjacent to the case, walked away from that day with a feeling they couldn't fully articulate. Something about the speed of it, something about the casket, something about the face of Vernon Presley at the funeral, which didn't look like grief so much as it looked like a man performing grief for an audience he didn't fully trust. People noticed. They filed it away. And for decades, it stayed there, in the back of the cultural mind, unresolved and quietly festering. Then came Bob Joyce. If you've never heard that name, take a breath, because the next few minutes are going to rearrange something in your brain that you won't be able to put back. Bob Joyce is a Baptist preacher from Benton, Arkansas. He has a congregation, a modest life, and by every visible measure, he is exactly what he appears to be, a man of faith doing the quiet work of ministry in a small southern town. He did not seek fame. He did not audition for anything. He did not walk onto a stage one day and announce a theory about himself. What happened instead was far stranger than that. The world found him. It started, like so many modern unravelings do, with a video. Someone filmed Bob Joyce singing at his church. It got shared, then shared again. Then it crossed some invisible threshold of virality where it stopped being a curiosity and became an obsession. Because when you watch that video, and millions of people have, something deeply unsettling happens. Your brain, which has spent decades cataloging the specific frequency of Elvis Presley's voice, the precise way he held a note, the almost physical weight of his baritone, starts sending signals it doesn't know how to process. Because what's coming out of Bob Joyce's mouth sounds less like an imitation of Elvis and more like an origin of him. But it doesn't stop at the voice. That would be too easy to explain. Vocal mimicry exists, and talented singers can approximate almost anything. What makes this different, what makes people pause in a way that genuine mimics don't produce, is everything around the voice. The jawline, the way the upper lip moves when he sings, the heaviness in the brow, the posture at a microphone, that specific forward lean, that ownership of a stage that can't be taught because it isn't technique, it's identity. People who have spent years studying Elvis Presley's physicality, researchers, biographers, fans with encyclopedic knowledge, have sat with footage of Bob Joyce and come away not laughing, but quiet, unsettled in a way they struggle to explain to people who haven't seen it. And here is where this stops being a fun internet rabbit hole and starts being something that deserves serious attention. Because the similarities people are pointing to aren't being generated by grief or wishful thinking alone. They are specific. They are documented. They are the kind of thing that, in any other context, would prompt an investigation rather than a dismissal. When two people share a voice, a face, a set of mannerisms, a physical presence, and a geographic and cultural origin all at once, at some point, the statistical weight of coincidence starts to buckle under its own load. Now, to be clear, Bob Joyce has not claimed to be Elvis Presley. He has not walked into a press conference and made a declaration. He has given vague, carefully worded statements when pressed, the kind of statements that neither confirm nor deny, the kind that a man gives when he is either deeply tired of a ridiculous question or deeply careful about a dangerous answer. And that ambiguity, that specific, deliberate ambiguity, is exactly what has kept this fire burning for years without oxygen. Because here is the thing that sits at the center of all of this. The thing that transforms this from a tabloid footnote into a genuine cultural mystery. There is a test, a simple, commercially available, scientifically irrefutable test that could end this entire conversation in 48 hours. Elvis Presley's DNA exists in documented, verifiable form. A comparison would not be complicated. It would not be expensive. It would not require years of litigation or a court order or an act of Congress. It would require a swab, a lab, and a willingness to let the truth land wherever it lands. Bob Joyce has not taken that test. He has not taken it publicly. He has not invited the scrutiny. He has not stood up in front of his congregation or a camera or a reporter and said, "Here, let's end this once and for all." And that silence, that specific, loaded, years-long silence, that is the most interesting thing about this entire story. Here's what's strange. It's not just the face. It's the things you can't fake. More than 90% of the people watching this video right now still aren't subscribed, and that means most people are missing out on exclusive, untold stories about Elvis Presley you won't find anywhere else. If you don't want to miss the next revelation, now's the time. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this video with one friend. Now let's continue. Anyone can look like someone else. Genetics are weird, the world is full of doppelgangers, and the human brain is wired to find patterns even when none exist. That's the easy dismissal, and it's the one most people reach for first when they encounter the Bob Joyce story. But that dismissal has a problem. It works fine when you're talking about one similarity, maybe two. It starts to collapse when you're stacking coincidence on top of coincidence on top of coincidence until the pile is so high that the word coincidence stops meaning anything at all. So let's talk about what's actually been documented. Not rumors, not fan fiction. The specific, verifiable details that serious researchers, people with no financial interest in the outcome, have cataloged over years of careful attention. Start with the voice. Not just the timbre, not just the range, but the behavior of the voice. The way certain vowels get stretched. The way emotion is carried not in volume but in restraint. That signature Elvis technique of pulling back right before a note peaks, creating tension through withholding rather than release. Amateur singers don't accidentally develop that. Professional mimics study it for years and still don't fully nail it. Bob Joyce does it naturally, unconsciously, in the middle of Sunday morning worship services in a small Arkansas church where nobody asked him to sound like anybody. That specificity matters. That's not a party trick. That's muscle memory built over a lifetime. Then there's the timeline. Bob Joyce's public presence, his emergence as a figure people outside his immediate community began to notice, doesn't begin until well into the 2000s. For the people who have mapped this theory carefully, that timing aligns in ways they find difficult to ignore. Elvis, had he survived and chosen a life of deliberate obscurity, would have been aging into the exact demographic window Bob Joyce occupies. The math isn't proof. But the math isn't nothing, either. What becomes even harder to set aside is the behavior around the subject itself. Most people, when falsely accused of being someone they're not, respond with some combination of confusion, irritation, and a very human desire to simply clear the air. If someone walked up to you tomorrow and insisted you were secretly a missing celebrity, your instinct would not be to issue careful, non-committal statements over a period of years. You would laugh. You would deny it flatly. You would probably find the whole thing absurd enough to joke about publicly. Bob Joyce has done none of that. What he has offered instead is a studied, almost diplomatic vagueness, the kind of response that feels less like a man brushing off nonsense and more like a man choosing his words with the precision of someone who understands exactly what is at stake in each one. Now bring in the Elvis side of this equation, because that story has its own unresolved edges that most people have forgotten about or never fully knew. The official autopsy findings were sealed for 50 years. 50 years. Medical records pertaining to a celebrity death, not a matter of national security, not a classified government operation, locked away from public scrutiny for half a century. The explanation given was privacy protection for the family, which is reasonable on its surface, until you start asking why privacy needed protecting for that long, and from whom. The doctor who performed the autopsy, Francisco Hernandez, went to his own grave maintaining that the cause of death was more complicated than the public record reflected. He never elaborated fully. He just stopped just short of the full story every single time he was asked. The funeral itself generated questions that have never been satisfactorily answered. Multiple attendees, people with no reason to lie and no conspiracy agenda, reported that the figure in the open casket didn't look right. Not grief distorted, not wrong in the way that embalmed bodies sometimes look unfamiliar, wrong in a more fundamental way. One close family associate reportedly said it looked like a wax figure, a comment that got buried under the avalanche of public mourning and only resurfaced years later when researchers began pulling threads. Vernon Presley, Elvis's father, reportedly made a comment in the days following the funeral that has been interpreted in wildly different ways depending on who's doing the interpreting, but the comment itself, in its original context, sounds less like a grieving father and more like a man who knew something the rest of the room didn't. None of this is a smoking gun. That's the honest truth, and it deserves to be stated plainly. Individually, every single one of these data points has an alternative explanation that a reasonable person could accept. But here's the question that keeps serious researchers up at night. At what point does a collection of alternative explanations become more implausible than the thing it's trying to explain away? At what point does the effort required to dismiss the evidence exceed the effort required to simply examine it? Because all of this, every layer of it, every sealed record and suspicious silence and uncanny vocal pattern collapses the moment one thing happens. And then consider what it actually means to be Bob Joyce in this moment. Set aside the theory entirely. Set aside Elvis and Graceland and 1977 and all of it. Just imagine being a man of faith, a man who has spent his entire adult life in service to something larger than himself, and waking up every morning to find that a significant portion of the world has decided that your life is not your own, that your voice, your face, your very identity is evidence in someone else's story, that no matter what you do or say, there is a narrative running parallel to your real life that you cannot fully enter and cannot fully escape. That is not a conspiracy. That is a psychological reality, and it is one that most people are entirely unprepared to sit with. What Bob Joyce carried in that silence for all those years was not nothing, and what he finally released into the world with his statement was not everything. Somewhere between those two things, between the silence and the statement, between what was said and what was withheld, the truth of this story is still breathing, still waiting, still refusing to be neatly resolved. And when he spoke, the conversation did not end. It exploded. New videos, new analysts, new voices flooding into a debate that his statement was supposed to close. Some silences, when broken, only make the world louder. Let's step back from the details for a moment. Let's step back from the vocal analyses and the jaw structure comparisons and the carefully parsed statements and the forum threads that run for hundreds of pages. Let's step all the way back and ask the question that sits underneath all of it. The question that nobody in this debate ever quite gets around to asking directly, because it feels too large, too uncomfortable, too honest. Why do we need Elvis Presley to still be alive? Not why do conspiracy theorists need it. Not why do the people who built YouTube channels around the comparison need it? Why does the culture, the broad, sprawling, multi-generational culture that has carried Elvis's legacy for nearly 5 decades since his death, why does it need him to still be somewhere on this earth, still breathing, still singing, even if only to a congregation in Arkansas on Sunday mornings? Because that need is real, and it is the engine that has driven every single chapter of this story. These are things that live in the body from decades of use. And then there's the faith layer, which is perhaps the most important piece of context that casual observers tend to skip past. Elvis Presley was not performatively religious. His relationship with gospel music and with God was not a PR strategy or a Southern affectation. It was the bedrock of who he was. The people closest to him knew it. Then there's Vernon Presley, Elvis's father, a man who by every account loved his son with a completeness that defined his entire existence. People who were present in the days immediately following the death announcement described Vernon's behavior as strange in ways they struggled to articulate, not the paralyzed, disintegrating grief of a father who had just lost his only child, but something more complicated, something that flickered, at moments, with an emotion that didn't quite match the occasion. These are subjective observations reported by human beings with their own biases and limitations, but they were made, they were documented, and they haven't disappeared. Now bring Bob Joyce back into the frame, because he hasn't been silent on this. He knows the theory exists, he knows millions of people have watched videos about him, analyzed his voice, compared his face to old photographs, and concluded, some of them with genuine conviction, that he is Elvis Presley living under a different name in a Baptist church in Arkansas. And he has addressed it. He has sat in front of cameras and denied it, calmly and with what appears to be good humor, the way a man addresses a rumor he finds more absurd than threatening. But fans, the ones who have watched those denials frame by frame, the ones who study this the way other people study case law, point to something in those moments that they find more unnerving than reassuring. The smile that arrives a half second too early. The answer that redirects rather than refutes. The particular brand of patience he shows when discussing it, the kind of patience that doesn't look like a man tired of a ridiculous accusation, it looks like a man who has made peace with carrying a secret. These are interpretations. They could be wrong. But they are consistent, and they keep being reported by people who watch the footage independently of each other. And then there is the silence that speaks louder than any of it. Bob Joyce has never taken a public DINA test. He is under absolutely no legal or moral obligation to do so. That much is unambiguous. A private citizen does not owe the internet a biological confirmation of his identity. One test, one comparison, one result that lands on a lab report and gets shared with the world. And Bob Joyce won't do it. Which stops being a curiosity the moment you ask the question that nobody in this conversation seems willing to ask directly. What does he have to lose? Let's stop asking why he won't take the test and start asking who benefits from him never taking it. Because that reframe changes everything. It shifts the weight of the question from one man's personal choice to a much larger, much darker architecture of interest and influence that most people haven't stopped to consider. And once you see that architecture clearly, Bob Joyce's silence stops looking like stubbornness or evasion and starts looking like something closer to survival. But let's be fair. Let's start with the most human explanation first, because it deserves its due before we go anywhere darker. Bob Joyce is, by every available account, a real minister with a real congregation and a real life that existed long before the internet decided he was a mystery to be solved. Think about what this theory has actually done to that life. He cannot lead a Sunday service without someone in the pew filming him on a phone. He cannot post a video of himself singing gospel music without the comment section erupting into a debate that has nothing to do with gospel music. He has become a spectacle, not because he sought the spotlight, but because the spotlight found him and refused to leave. For a man whose entire vocation is built around quiet service and spiritual community, that kind of relentless public scrutiny isn't just uncomfortable, it's a violation. And a man in that position, a man of genuine faith trying to protect the integrity of his ministry and the dignity of his congregation, might make the very reasonable decision that engaging with this theory in any public, formal way, including submitting to a Dana test that gets live-streamed for internet consumption, would do more damage than the silence ever could. That is a legitimate reason. It is a deeply human reason. And it deserves to be acknowledged before anything else. But it doesn't fully explain the specific texture of his responses. Because there's a difference between a man who refuses to engage because the question is beneath him, and a man who refuses to engage because the answer is complicated. One of those men dismisses the question, the other one manages it. And Bob Joyce, in the rare moments when this subject has surfaced directly in front of him, has consistently chosen management over dismissal. That choice, that very specific, very deliberate choice, is where the human explanation starts to run out of road. So consider the second layer. The financial and legal catastrophe that a positive Dana result would detonate. Elvis Presley's estate is not a sentimental archive. It is an active, aggressively managed commercial empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The licensing, the royalties, the image rights, the ongoing revenue streams attached to the name and likeness of Elvis Presley are controlled by a corporate infrastructure that has spent decades building walls around that asset. If a Dana test produced a result that suggested Elvis Presley did not die in 1977, that he was, in some legally cognizable sense, still alive and identifiable, the chain reaction of litigation that would follow would be unlike anything the entertainment industry has ever seen. Wills would be contested. Inheritance claims would be filed. The entire legal foundation of the estate collapses the moment the death certificate it rests on becomes questionable. These are not hypothetical consequences. These are concrete, foreseeable, devastating outcomes, and every single person with a financial stake in the current arrangement knows it. Now ask yourself, how many of those people have the resources, the reach, and the motivation to ensure that a certain Baptist preacher in Arkansas never does anything that brings that outcome closer to reality? That question leads to the third layer, and this is the one that sits heaviest. There is a version of this story in which Bob Joyce doesn't need to be told to stay silent, because he already understands with perfect clarity why silence is the only option that doesn't end in ruin. Not his ruin specifically, the ruin of people he loves, people connected to him, people whose lives would be upended by a truth that the world is not actually prepared to receive as cleanly as it thinks it is. The mythology of Elvis Presley's death is not just a story about one man. It is woven into the fabric of American cultural memory. It anchored a generation's grief. It gave people a moment of collective mourning that meant something. To unravel that is not to correct the historical record. It is to retroactively hollow out an experience that millions of people hold as genuinely sacred. And a man who understands that, who feels the weight of it, might decide that the truth, in this particular case, costs more than it's worth. And then there is the possibility that lives underneath all of the others, the one nobody wants to say out loud in plain language. The possibility that Bob Joyce has already been told, clearly and without ambiguity, by someone with the power to enforce the message that this particular door needs to stay closed, that the test doesn't happen, that the silence continues. Not as a request, as an understanding. Because the people who have the most to lose from the truth in this story are not ordinary people. They are not powerless people. And history has shown repeatedly and without sentiment that powerful interests protecting enormous assets do not simply hope for the best. They make arrangements. And somewhere in the middle of all those arrangements, a preacher in Arkansas keeps singing on Sunday mornings, and the world keeps watching, and the test never happens. Here's the truth nobody in this conversation wants to say out loud. It doesn't matter which way the test goes. Both outcomes break something. Both outcomes leave a mark that doesn't fully heal. And the people who understand that most clearly, who feel it in their bones rather than just processing it intellectually, are the ones who have gone the quietest on this subject. Not the loudest, the quietest. Because noise is easy. Living with either version of the answer is not. So let's walk through it. Both doors. All the way to the end. If a DNA test came back positive, if the science confirmed what millions of people have suspected across decades of amateur investigation and obsessive comparison, the immediate aftermath would not look like justice or revelation. It would look like chaos. The kind of slow-moving, institution-shaking chaos that doesn't announce itself all at once but spreads through every connected system like water finding cracks in a foundation. The death certificate issued in Shelby County, Tennessee, in August of 1977 becomes a fraudulent document. Every legal instrument built on top of that document, the estate, the will, the inheritance, the decades of probate decisions, becomes contestable in ways that no court system is equipped to resolve cleanly or quickly. The people who inherited the Elvis empire, who built careers and identities and financial security on the foundation of his documented death, wake up in a world where the ground under them has shifted without warning. But the legal catastrophe, as enormous as it is, isn't even the deepest wound. The deeper wound is cultural. Think about what Elvis's death meant, not as a fact, but as an event. It was a generational anchor, a shared moment of grief that bonded people across geography and background and age. Fans who stood outside Graceland in August of 1977, people who wept in their living rooms, parents who held their children and tried to explain what loss felt like, those experiences were real. The emotion was real. The meaning people drew from that collective mourning was real. A positive DNA test doesn't just correct the historical record. It retroactively reframes every one of those moments as something that happened in response to a lie. And that is not a small thing to absorb. That is not a correction that lands gently. Now close that door. Open the other one. If the test came back negative, if the science said clearly and finally that Bob Joyce and Elvis Presley share no meaningful biological connection, most people assume that ends the story. And on the surface, it would. The headlines would declare the theory debunked, the internet would move on to the next obsession, and Bob Joyce could theoretically return to his ministry without a camera in every pew. That's the clean version. But here's what actually happens underneath the clean version. The question doesn't die. It goes underground. Because the people most invested in this theory are not invested in it because of the evidence alone, they're invested in it because of what believing it does for them. It becomes mythology. It becomes conspiracy. It becomes a Baptist preacher in Arkansas who sings with a voice that sounds like a ghost, and a world that watches him and feels something it cannot name. Bob Joyce may be Elvis Presley. The evidence, stacked honestly and without agenda, is more than enough to warrant serious inquiry. Or Bob Joyce may be a man who has spent years trapped inside someone else's legend through no fault of his own, unable to escape a resemblance that the world decided meant something before he had any say in the matter. Both of those possibilities are real. Both deserve to be held with honesty and without mockery. But the test hasn't happened, and every day that it doesn't, the silence grows heavier, more deliberate, more loaded with the specific weight of things that are known but not spoken, understood but not confirmed. And that silence at this point is its own kind of answer, not to the question of who Bob Joyce is, but to the question of how much truth the people around this story are actually willing to let into the light. So here is the question this story leaves you with. Not whether Bob Joyce is Elvis. Not whether the death was faked or the records were sealed for reasons that don't hold up to scrutiny. The question is this: why do we need him to be? And what does it say about us that after all this time, after everything, we're still standing outside Graceland in August, waiting for a king to come home? If this story cracked something open in you, drop your theory in the comments right now, because this conversation is just getting started. Subscribe if you want the next layer of this, because we're not done. And send this to someone who thinks they already know the whole Elvis story. They don't.